All right, so we've been in Genesis 3 the last few weeks. We've talked about the serpent's judgment. We finished that up last week. And in the midst of the serpent being cursed, and he is explicitly cursed, we found that even in the midst of judgment, God promises a gracious redemption as the seed that is going to come from the woman and the man together. But through the woman, the seed will be born, and he will ultimately triumph, or they will ultimately triumph over the serpent. The seed can be singular or plural, depending on the context. I think the Hebrew word can be both singular and plural, because I think it's spelled the same way, regardless. It's like sheep. Is it one sheep or is it multiple sheep? I don't know. It's sheep. You have to match it with a verb or an adverb or an adjective or something to tell you if it's singular or plural. I think seed is the same way, but I don't remember. I'll have to look that up before we get too much further. So, having finished that up, we talked about the structure, how God, when he comes along to judge, he called the man to account. The man blamed the woman, so he turned to the woman. And then the woman blamed the serpent, so he turned to the serpent. So God cursed the serpent. Now we're moving backwards back to the woman. And this is a very quick verse, but like all poetry, it is meant to say a lot with as few words as possible. So this is the only verse we're going to look at tonight. Genesis 3:16. It says, "To the woman, he, God, said, I will make your pains in childbearing very severe. With painful labor you will give birth to children. Your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you." So we want to talk about a couple of things here as we go on the judgment on the woman. Now, the man and the woman, their judgments here are a little bit different than the serpent's, in part because the serpent is cursed. In verse 17, God curses the ground. So he doesn't curse the man or the woman. Here, the word curse isn't even used. And we'll need to talk about why. But I want to point out just in part of this is about as merciful as God is ever going to be in judgment right here to the woman. He doesn't use the term cursed. He doesn't curse her or anything about who and what she's supposed to be, who and what she's supposed to do. And so the term itself doesn't come up at all. And God is not going to be as harsh with her as he is with the man. Because as we will talk about next week, regardless of how tough you think I am or I'm not being on the woman here, he is way, way, way more harsh on the man. And in fact, everything that hits the woman here affects the man, and everything that hits the man in the next few verses is going to affect the woman. So this does not exclude the man. Let's just be clear about this. What's going to affect her is going to have its effect on her husband, and through them, all their children. If you think of the narratives and the characters of Adam and Eve as archetypes, individuals who express all the ideas under an umbrella, all the ideas of what it is to be a man, all of the ideas of what it is to be a woman, are archetypically assumed here by the first man and the first woman. Everything that God has to say about man, he's saying it to Adam in a very general, broad sense. Everything God has to say about woman, he's saying in a very broad sense in chapter 2. Now in chapter 3, because of the judgment, everything that's going to affect every man is being said to Adam, and everything that's on some level going to affect every woman is going to be said to the woman here, and they're both mutually going to affect each other. But one thing that is not affected is that the man and the woman themselves are not cursed, and the woman here doesn't even get the term brought up. And I want us to consider why that might be, given the other chapters in Genesis we've already covered. Why does God not curse the woman or the ground or something like the woman? My short answer is, that I will explain, is God is not going to be proven wrong in his choices. In Genesis 1:28, God has already chosen to bless humanity by multiplying their offspring. He's already said that. If God reneged on that blessing and turned it to curse, he would be admitting defeat and the serpent would win.
Could it be that a curse is a permanent punishment? And God, that's why the woman's not cursed. We still pay a price for our sin.
Well,
but it's not a permanent price like a curse is.
Well, it may be temporal in a certain sense, because the ground is going to be what's cursed, but God is going to lift that curse when he recreates. Part of why recreation is necessary is because the ground, or as Paul says in Romans, creation is groaning, waiting for the sons of God to be revealed. He's waiting for Christ to come back and actually release the curse that's placed on creation. What is happening here is not a curse. It's not a curse to have children. It's not a curse to be a wife. That's not the curse. That's the blessing. And although what God is doing here is frustrating the purpose of the man and the woman so that they have a harder time fulfilling it, ultimately God is trying to say, look, unless you come back to me and let me rule and be king again and stop deciding what is right and wrong on your own, you're never going to fulfill your purpose. The curse is on the serpent is not temporal. That never gets lifted. That is a permanent curse. He is cursed. But the curse on the ground is not permanent. That is temporal. He's going to the point of cursing the serpent is to say you're ultimately going to lose, and you're never going to be as great and as glorious as you think and are trying to be right now. But by not cursing the man, by not cursing the woman, but by cursing the ground, or here, just judging and frustrating her purposes as a mother and a wife, God is not giving up on the fact that he wants to bless humanity. That's a different thing than what this. Recall that I surmised that the serpent is trying to use God to put the man and the woman to death. That he, as a celestial being, is in the garden with God, and he hears God's decree in 2:7 that says, the day that you eat of the fruit, you're going to die. And he doesn't like humans. He doesn't think these guys are worthy. And so if he gets them to violate God's command, God will put them to death. God, if he put them to death, he would be admitting defeat. He would be letting the serpent win because the serpent got what he wanted and God didn't get what he wanted. God is not going to be proven wrong by some stupid serpent or a bunch of Homo sapiens. That is not going to happen. God is not wrong to give humanity authority over creation. God is not wrong to use the marriage relationship to multiply human beings. He is not wrong to have set up and established the dynamic relationships between male and female that chapter 2 has already told us about, and we've already gone over. When you get to the curse of chapter 3, the judgment of their rebellion, God doesn't curse anything to do with woman's responsibility and purpose. And if you followed the woman's responsibility and purpose thus far, and we think about it tonight, we should understand some very, very deep truths about femininity and being a female image bearer that the judgment is going to affect, but not undo, not stop, just make it very, very hard for you to want to do it in one way or another. So despite all the rebellion of his image bearers up to this point, all two of them, against his own good and kingly reign, God is not going to fail to fulfill his own plans and will through humanity. This is the same reason why every time God wants to do something in the earth, he picks a human representative because he is going to work in and through humanity. He chose to use image bearers through whom to rule the physical world and expand Eden across the planet. And despite our rebellion, he will see that plan succeeds, which means the blessings of 128 must stand. Humanity will multiply, they will rule, and they will subdue creation, even in spite of the sin that has now come into their lives. So I refer to it as this: judgment is primary, not sole. It is primarily here on the woman, but it is, of course, going to affect the man because they're married, they're sharing a single life. So it is not solely going to affect the woman. And this is going to hold next week when we start breaking down the man's judgment. It is going to rebound and reflect back on the woman because they're going to share one life. So verses 17 through 18, 19, I forget which, it is primarily going to be the man's judgment, not the sole point of the man, because in fact we're all affected by it and living under it to this day. Now, this language of saying, I will increase your pains in childbearing, your desire will be for your husband, these two major halves of verse 16 break down like this. They affect what it means to be a mother and what it means to be a wife. The two fundamental reasons why God created a second, fundamentally different image bearer from the man that already existed. So he's deliberately judging you, because of your rebellion, your motherhood capacities will be restricted, affected on some level. Your ability to be a wife who's a suitable helper for your husband is going to now be called into question. So we want to talk about what is the purpose of woman as a mother and what is the purpose of woman as a wife. Just as next week when we get to Adam, his purpose as a husband and a father are going to be affected, but indirectly, it's not really going to talk about his role as a father. That's kind of assumed here and how it affects the woman, and possibly by this idea of him ruling over you. So let's talk about this, starting with woman's purpose as a mother. The language of 16, the first two parts, A and B, seem to form a basic merism. We'll just go back to this slide. Pains in childbearing, with painful labor you will give birth to children. So from conception to birth is at the very least the idea. It suggests that every aspect from conception to birth is going to be difficult. It's not merely the labor itself. Woman will fulfill her God-given purpose as a mother, but it's just not going to be easy. And yet, despite everything that it takes and all the pain a woman knows she's going to have to go through for 9 months, plus however many hours of labor it's going to take, she will still voluntarily go through the process because she wants to fulfill her purpose of motherhood. It's not being taken away from her. God's gift to her of saying, I'm gifting you motherhood, that purpose is going to stand. But you're not without consequences for your rebellion. So what's going to happen is I'm going to let you fulfill your purpose, but it's going to be exponentially more difficult. A part of this is probably also that this phrase, with painful labor you will give birth to children. That's probably pretty explicitly about the birthing process. But this phrase here, I will make your pains in childbearing. We translate this word childbearing, and that gives the labor notion to our minds. In Hebrew, this phrase here, pains in child rearing, might be more exact because the A line here, your pains in child rearing, very severe, seems to be the entire process of raising children, not even just birth, conception, carrying, birth, or anything. The entire process of raising a child is going to be painful on some level, which I'm sure you ladies could tell me more about than I could tell you, so I'm not going to harp on that. The beeline seems to be explicitly about the birthing process. Painful labor, you will give birth. However, it's not just going to be that moment in time. The entire process of motherhood is going to be much more emphatically difficult to do. Any questions on this line here or any comments that you want to make? Cool. That one's pretty straightforward. So, again, God is not taking away the gift of motherhood. He's not taking away the responsibility of motherhood. He's just going to say it's now going to be more difficult. And actually, let me say one more thing about this, because I don't have this on a slide. But one of the things that this means is probably that before they're cursed, well, the curse, they're not cursed, before God judges them and exiles them from the garden, the question comes up, was it always painful for them to have babies, or is this now going to be the start of the painful process? And it's an open-ended question. I would suggest, however, that a part of what this is saying, part of what all these judgments are saying, is that although God is not taking away your rights as women, your gifts that God has given you, your responsibilities as mothers, one thing is that you're not going to be guaranteed the success of carrying a child all the way to term. It is not necessarily that it would have not been painful for them before this, and now God is going to make it painful. Really, the idea of this is to say, now you won't be guaranteed success. Now you may have a child, and that child will be a pain in your butt for its entire life, and that child may grow up to hate you. It's not guaranteed. It was not guaranteed that before this enters in, it may have been the fact that they had painful child labor would have been painful. However, the child would ultimately have lived and grown up in the peace and paradise of Eden, and all would have been well. Exactly. You get to feel the pain of disobedience because of your disobedience. But that's a good way to describe the overall process. However, on top of that, you're not guaranteed that the child is going to live is a part of this. It can be that painful to fulfill your roles as a mother. That's kind of a part of the poetry here. And you really have to break that down. Because the childbearing process will now be very severe, and you are not guaranteed success. When it comes to the ground being cursed, it's very similar in poetic flavor to the man saying, by the sweat of your brow, you're going to eat of the fruit. You can put all this work and time and effort into it, and you're still not guaranteed that the harvest is going to be there. For the woman, that's captivated in both the motherhood process and the wife aspect of this. Just because you get married does not mean you're going to have the Disney happily ever after thing. It's going to be difficult to actually relate to your husband. Just as it's going to be difficult to have children and relate to your children because the consequences of your obedience is going to spread to their your disobedience is going to spread and become their disobedience, and all your relationships and purposes are now going to be frustrated. So her purpose as mother is frustrated. And now, in a very short, simple phrase, her purpose as wife, suitable helper to the man, is going to be frustrated. And this is where the battle of the sexes begin. This is where you get ladies like Cruella de Vil, Ursula, and Maleficent, the archetypal female characters who are just plain bad, have no redeeming features or qualities. That's right. God is a God of equality, and yes, women can be the villain. And so we get the battle of the sexes, and we get a word here the Hebrew word teshukah, a very rare word in the Old Testament. In fact, it only occurs 2 more times. Once in the Song of Songs, in chapter 7:10, it speaks positively about sexual desire, because the word means desire. However, in Genesis 4:7, when God is talking to Cain, after Cain's face fell, or his countenance fell, after God didn't accept his sacrifice and only accepted Abel's, God tells him, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now look at this phrase. Desires to have you, you must rule over it. Then look back at this sentence. Desire will be for your husband. He will rule over you. Evil, yeah. It's she can be considered sin, or okay. So um so we need to break this down so that doesn't happen, and people don't run away with this and think, okay, her desire is evil, potentially, yes, but the whole point of this chapter is that now, man or woman, your motivations are screwed up, because you're fundamentally deciding what is right and wrong on your own without God. That's the problem here. So now, in relationship to her husband, her desire is going to be, I'll decide what's right and wrong, and I'll tell you what to do. This is a part of what is being communicated here, because it's very much like Genesis 4:7. The language is very much, it's one chapter over, it's the next thing. It's like the author of Genesis wants us to read Genesis 3:16 and 4:7 as telling you the same thing. So this is a negative connotation here. You don't want to desire in this case. In Song of Songs, yeah, the other time it speaks of desire, that sexual desire there is perfectly good and positive. But in the book of Genesis, it's only negative to desire something. In the context of wanting to rule apart from God, you cannot desire the right thing. So when he says your desire will be for your husband, he doesn't mean you're going to be sexually attracted to your husband. He means something more akin to you're going to want to unlawfully and unjustly be in charge of another person. So these terms are extremely close. He wants us to see a connection between these stories. So in both these passages, desire has to do with unlawfully wanting to be in charge, to have power, to have dominion over another, to tyrannize in some form another person and make demands of them. Is this something that a man can do? Absolutely. That's why it's being used of Cain. Its desire is to have you. And if it gets a hold of you, Cain, what kind of person are you going to be? That's the kind of conversation God is having with Cain. If you open that door up and let sin have its desire over you, what are you going to do? And that's exactly what he did, because he went out and he killed his brother in the very next passage. Right? This is not a good idea. This is why it's a battle of the sexes and why it's beginning right here. The relationship between husbands and wives is now going to be disrupted at a very fundamental level. She is now going to be trying to gain some sort of upper hand over her husband that will allow her dominance and her control in the relationship. And that shouldn't surprise anyone, because we're dealing with the concept of eating forbidden fruit, which, as I've told you, is about deciding for yourself what is right and wrong. And if you eat this fruit, what are you going to do? You're going to think that you know what is right and wrong. Look at me. Let's take it back and think for a second. When the text says their eyes were open and they knew they were naked, I made the point that Hebrew word for naked is a play on words. It's the Hebrew word arum. It's the same word that describes the serpent in 3:1. God, the serpent was more arum than all the beasts of the field, right? That's the point. The picture, and because I don't think I said this, is is really that they ate the fruit, they wake up and they think, ha ha, I am wise, I am shrewd. And then they're looking around and they're self-congratulating, and then they happen to look down and realize they're naked. And then and that's all that their wisdom and roominess gets them. Their craftiness, their shrewdness, they're on the serpent's side, and now they have a brief moment where they think that they know everything, and then they look down and they see just how little they actually know. And they're self-conscious about the fact that they don't really know anything. And that's why it's pseudo-wisdom. Here, that is going to affect her in the sense of saying, my husband's an idiot, which is true, because all men are idiots. Yes, amen. I'm not denying that. But, uh, but that doesn't mean that what should happen is that she should now make all the rules unilaterally and apart from what God has said. Because he says, nonetheless, the husband will remain the head of the wife. He will be in authority over her because that's how God set it up. This is why Adam was created first and why the woman was brought in second. This is Paul's point in Timothy, where he follows the creation order, not the fall, to explain why he doesn't want husbands to sit back and let their wives actually teach things in the church when their husbands are the ones who are supposed to get up and do it. He understands the consequences of the judgment curse here. He understands that that would be upside down and backwards. There is an order to the way things are supposed to go. But we, both of us, remember, we're picking on ladies tonight, but this is fundamentally true of the man in a different way. In a different way, it's going to be fundamentally true of how this affects the man and how the man's going to respond. But it doesn't undo God's created design. God created the husband first for a purpose, and just as God is not taking away the woman's gift of childbearing and gift of being a suitable helper for her husband, he is not going to take away the man's responsibility to be the head of the family. He's not going to do it, even if the man is going to be very, very bad at fulfilling it, because the man is lost in his own thoughts, thinking he knows right and wrong. But what is not going to be good is for his wife, who's supposed to be a suitable helper, a compatible helper, however you want to say that, is not for her to think that she knows everything and she should and can tell him what to do all the time. So God is not undoing or rejecting the marriage covenant between the sexes that he instituted. He is frustrating it in such a way to suggest this: if you do not come back to me as your God, if you do not let me decide what is right and wrong, you will never have the connection and the intimacy in this marriage relationship that I offered you. You will always be fighting for control. You will always be fighting for dominance over the person that you're actually supposed to be a compatible, suitable partner for. If you think that you know more than God, you think you know more than the person sitting next to you. And if you think you don't have to listen to God, why would you think that you have to listen to the lesser beings that you're sitting next to on a Sunday morning or that you share a home with? You won't. It doesn't work that way. You have to consider that God knows better than you in order to listen to God and want his understanding and wisdom for how you're supposed to relate to each other. This explains why in the New Testament, women who are redeemed are told to submit to their husbands without that ever actually being reciprocated. Not one time in the New Testament is a husband ever told, submit to your wife. Not once. There is a phrase in Ephesians that said, submit to one another. That is not about husbands and wives. That is about the leadership of the church that are all of the same rank in what we would call a church office. Only after he says, so submit to one another, talking to them, does he turn to the familial structures and start talking to husbands and wives. Now, husbands do not need to rule over their wives in a way that tears them down. That would be a bad reading to this, and it has been a historical misunderstanding that flows out of this. Oh, women is guilty in this right. Yes, but you actually have to pay attention to how man is guilty, and we'll get to that next week, so that you don't automatically assume that because man is the woman is guilty here, and something's happening in this judgment, that man gets to do whatever the chuck he wants. He doesn't. If a man or a husband lives in such a way as to tear down his woman, he's completely undoing everything that God wants. No man or husband will ever relate to his wife in an understanding and compassionate way as a guardian priest, like Adam is supposed to be, unless he rejects Adam's rebellion and makes Yahweh God over his life, not himself. So this is my counterpoint to this. Yes, the woman is thinking too much of herself here, and God is going to fundamentally frustrate the marriage relationship. But the answer to it is for both man and wife to say, what is God's intention and design for our relationship? Let's both agree to listen to him and do things his way. That way is going to be the man was made first, the head of the family was created, and the woman was brought later. That created intention tells the story. He expects something of the man that doesn't necessarily rebound to the woman, which is why her judgment here is a couple of quick lines, and then God moves on and hits Adam with everything because he was the highest human authority. She does not have the same authority in the garden that he does, which is why she's not held responsible the way that Adam will be. And she is primarily responsible here, but Adam is primarily responsible for her. She's his wife. He could have stopped it. Again, she wasn't there when God issued the decree not to eat the fruit. Adam was. Adam should have somehow understood and put a stop to everything that's happening here so that this didn't end up happening, but he didn't. Adam's failure far, far exceeds this woman's, our first mother. So when we're talking about equality, you have to talk about equality in what sense? And you have to keep these stories in context. Genesis 1 gives us a macro picture of humanity's status before God, largely in the poetic statements, God made them male and female, which means that regardless of whether you're male or female, you're naturally or ontologically equal. You're equal before God in status. You're both 100% human. Nobody is better off before God because they're a man. Nobody is less worse off before God because they're a woman, and vice versa. You are not worse off before God because you're a man. You are not better off before God because you're a woman. It doesn't work that way. And this is what Genesis 1 is telling us when God creates man and woman in his image. We are meant to share responsibility of ruling creation as one. And if that were the only story that there is, the egalitarian interpretation of the Bible would be the correct one. That man and woman are equal before God, therefore none is greater than the other and none has more authority over the other. But that is not the only story. You have to hold these truths in tension with chapter 2, which is this micro picture zoomed in on the human relationships of particularly husbands and wives in marriage by telling us the first marriage that says Adam was created first for a reason, so that he could serve and guard the garden in Eden. And so to do this, he mimics God's rule over creation the same way that God does. Adam names all the animals in chapter 2, just as God names all the creation things that he makes in chapter 1. And then when no suitable helper for Adam is found among the animals, God creates the woman out of his side meat. And then Adam exercises authority over his wife, meaning he takes responsibility for the woman, when he comes along and names her, as he has named the animals, as God has named creation. That is a authority exercise. When enemy armies came in and conquered a place, they would largely and typically rename it. It was a very common practice to say, your old identity is gone, your new identity is this, and it's usually, we're going to humiliate you in what we call you now. At least in the ancient Near East, that was pretty typical. So when David conquers Jebus from the Jebusites, the city of the Jebusites called Jebus, he renames it Jerusalem, city of peace, because that was the new idea. And he could do that because he now had authority over the city from conquering it. This is this right here, naming the woman, calling her woman out of man, exercises power and authority over her before sin enters the world, before there's aggression and dominance that the second part of 3:16 is talking about. Although he will no doubt take responsibility over her very, very badly from here on out, he nonetheless maintains his headship role in the relationship to her. Again, because God is not going to be proven wrong. The entrance of sin does not mean that God was wrong to create the man first and give him the ultimate power. It was for her protection. So you have to hold the two statements together. All humans are created equal before God, but husbands and wives are made for each other, but are not the same types of human. They do not exist as the same genders. They are not going to, because of that, they are not going to fulfill the same roles in their relationship towards one another, towards their offspring. You're just not going to it. You're not built for it. You're biologically and chemically designed for things. And now we have a third poetic statement in 3:16 that throws a wrench into the whole machine. She is, from this point on, not going to want to be submissive to her husband's authority. She's not going to want to show respect as God intended, because she's already disrespected God. Disrespecting Adam is nothing compared to that. But now, your disrespect for your husband is your disrespect for God, because he put the authority over you. Your disrespect from your children is their disrespect for God, because God put you collectively in authority over them. This is what the fifth commandment, honor your mother and father, is actually all about. Accept and respect, and if you can, obey the authority over you, human or divine, because that's how God wanted it. But she's not going to do that, so she'll seek power, she'll seek control over him, usually unconsciously, but he will remain head of the household family unit. In fact, I would probably translate that line, your desire will be for your husband, but he will remain head over you, or he will continue ruling over you, something like that. Instead of an and he will rule over you, I would make that a vav. That's the Hebrew letter there for the conjunction. I would turn that into a vav of contrast, not and, but. But he will go on ruling over you. It acknowledges that God did this in creation, and he's going to continue it in spite of sin's presence. Now, we could talk all day long about how men have abused this and broken this on their own side, and we'll get to a little bit of that next week. But it doesn't fundamentally undo this, because, again, God is not taking away her ability to be a mother. And so, what is she going to need if God is not going to take that away? God is not going to take away his headship status as a husband. And that's actually supposed to serve her needs. And if you think about it, we have some possible answers to some questions here about why God designed it this way. So the question, does God give unlimited power to husbands? Obvious answer. No, not unlimited power. Primary power, not sole power. He has to share power with her. He does not get absolute tyrannical power, even if she is disrespectful and trying to tyrannize him, because her desire is to rule. He does not get to clamp down on that, right? Are men guilty of abusing women? Are husbands guilty of using their authority in self-serving ways at the expense of their wives? Yes, absolutely. Does that mean that men are disqualified from their roles as the husbandly heads? No. They are no more disqualified than God disqualified women from the honor of and responsibility of being mothers of the new image bearers. If God is not taking away your rights as mothers, the gifts that he's given you, he's also not taking away the responsibility and gifts he's given to humanity, men, and let's talk about how that works. If God is going to preciously keep her purpose going despite the presence of sin, why would he not do the same for the man that he created? And if you think about it, let me just pose this question. Let's see what we can get here in like 3 minutes. Why might God have made man to be the heads of the household and given women the honor of carrying the children? Now, I want you to think physically here. about the process of childbearing. You know, that's a good point. Because men are not as tough as women. Not when it comes to their body turning on themselves, because heck, you guys deal with that every month. The fact that you have to deal with it for 9 months of a parasite in your body growing and taking over and stuff until it becomes a full-fledged person that can break out into its own, tells you something. Look, the toll and the exertion it takes to be pregnant, that it takes to give birth, and that it takes to play physical caregiver to infants, it makes women extremely vulnerable, physically speaking. So, the physically stronger of the pairing, the husband, is charged with using his superior strength and less changing physical attributes, like he doesn't have a period. He doesn't menstruate. Our bodies just work the same way 30 days out of 30 days, okay? We don't go down until the man flu hits us, okay? But when it does, we go down. But assuming that that's not the case, we have a less changing physical attributes, okay? Maybe that's actually a good thing because it provides protection for the vulnerable wife and child. Maybe that's the reason. It was never about dominating her. It was for her own good that God gave gave responsibility over her and for her to him, her husband. She's gonna need it because she's opening herself up to a very vulnerable physical thing. Her provision, her protection is emphasized as his responsibility. And he has failed at this in this chapter, which is why judgment's coming for him way more than her. Well, I shouldn't say way more, but harsher. While her responsibility emphasizes physical vulnerability, the physical responsibility that women have as mothers means they actually do need a protector. Because contrary to the lies of modern feminism, you can't be a girl boss and do it all. If you're going to take on the role of a mother, it's going to physically make you vulnerable. First off, you have to be vulnerable to a man to get pregnant. Secondly, you have to be vulnerable to the baby because the baby is physically going to sap your strength throughout the 9 months of pregnancy. Then you have to be vulnerable during the labor process. Then the infant in its vulnerability is going to require vulnerability from you to raise that infant. It would be best if there was a division of labor in which one person could actually do the physical labors without being physically weakened by the birth of a new image bearer. Wouldn't that be better than just trying to have to do it all on your own? But of course, it's stipulated upon the idea that you don't have to raise your husband like a giant man-child. Wouldn't it be nice if men actually stepped up and took responsibility not only for their households, but for their wives, and says, I will not be another child that my wife has to force to grow up. The childbearing process of her motherhood roles are going to be hard enough on the woman, on her alone. I don't need to add to her burdens by being another child. So let me get my life together. Let me order creation and my life as far as it depends on me so that I can actually be of service to her so that she can fulfill her role. And I think if we do that, I don't think most women in their right minds are going to have a problem actually submitting to men. At least not their own husbands. It's not women submitting to men. It's just wives submitting to their husbands. This is not all women submitting to all men. That's how it gets abused stupidly. So, if we think about that, I think we should come to those natural conclusions because no matter how the ideas play out, you cannot get away from that. Women are going to seek out being mothers. To do that, they're going to have to turn to men, and men are going to have to fulfill their roles to it, and we will bust men down a peg next week.